I'd like to welcome this full and beautiful room to the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. My name is Aaron Espinoza, and I'm the Library Observatory Director, as well as the Executive Director of the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. So thank you so much for being here. Before we get started, please turn off your ringer on your cell phone. I know every one of you thinks you've already done it. Please check it. So before we get started, I just want to talk about some of our upcoming programs. I could sit up here for the next hour and talk about our programs. I won't, I promise you. But before you leave, if you have not already, please take a look at our quarterly program guide. You can find it as you exit. We have a multitude of different programming coming up. We have one tomorrow night, jazz pianist Lenore Raphael. She is one of our fan favorites here. And then in regards to our writer series, we have a number of programs coming up. So next Thursday, October 20th, we have author and screenwriter Kirk Wallace Johnson speaking about his book, The Fisherman and the Dragon, Fear, Greed, and the Fight for Justice on the Gulf Coast. The following Tuesday, on October 25th, we have best-selling author and award-winning producer Melissa Rivers, talking about her book, Lies My Mother Told Me, Tall Tales from a Short Woman. On Thursday, October 27th, we have award-winning author Janet Skisling Charles coming all the way from Paris to talk about her book, The Paris Library. And then on Friday, October 28th, yes, that is 3 programs in 1 week, we have veteran fashion and cultural journalist Amy Odell speaking on her book about Anna Wintour. For more of our programming, please visit our website at www.rmwritersfest to learn more about our programming. Before I get further into our programs, I'd like to take a moment and thank our city council members that are in attendance here. We have Council Member Steve Downs and Council Member Ted Weil. Many years ago, Jamie Cavell, our founder, had asked us, our staff, who did you want to see at the Writers Series, the Writers Festival? And I'm going to tell you, Kate Quinn was on the top of the list and has been there for many years. I would like to take a moment and thank Jamie and our Writers Festival team for bringing not only Kate, but we have 14 authors, or we have 12 more authors coming by the end of the year. We have 4 more already lined up for the new fiscal, or for the new year in 2023. So Jamie, thank you. Today's author leads very little introduction, but I am still going to go through this. She is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of historical fiction. She has written 4 novels in the Empress of Rome Saga, with 2 of the books in the Italian Renaissance, before turning to the 20th century with New York Times bestsellers, The Alice Network, and The Huntress. Please join me in welcoming Kate Quinn.
Shorty problems. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I will do my absolute best to live up to it. And thank you all for being here today. I really am so delighted to be back here in the desert. Not only because I had such a wonderful, warm welcome when I did an event here in town much earlier this year, but because I have spent most of my time lately in the Pacific Northwest, and I feel a bit like a mole stumbling up from underground, blinking and wondering just what this big, round, warm thing in the sky is. So really, thank you for not only inviting me to come talk to you about books today, but to get a little much-needed reminder of what sunlight feels like. My vitamin D levels are thanking you. But really, principally, I love being back among book lovers again, because being able to browse in my local library or local bookshop is something I, for one, feel like I will never take for granted again after having been so long in lockdown. Now, I'm a librarian's daughter, so I grew up, running around libraries my whole life, and they contain some of my fondest memories. I was the kid who was, staggering out under a stack of books that I could barely see over, always shooting an incredulous look whenever some clueless adult would be cooing, "Are you really gonna read all those?" To which I still wonder, what is the appropriate response to that? It's like, no, I just need a lot of doorstops at home. Thank you for asking. I was the kid who ran up library fines in quite literal double digits, and that still never discouraged me from taking more books out. Now, of all my memories, though, my fondest is probably the bathtub at Long Beach Main Library, where I spent so much time as a kid. Tucked among the shelves in the children's section at Maine was a huge, old-fashioned, clawfoot bathtub that was padded with quilts and pillows, where anybody who wanted to could climb in and read to their heart's content. That bathtub was big enough to fit 4 little girls with their Saddle Club paperbacks, or 2 exhausted moms with babies in snugglies and the latest Debbie Macomber novel. That bathtub was magic. Kids instinctively understood that it was actually magic, and it might decide to fly and take you off to Narnia or Oz or whatever unknown fantasy land you were dreaming of. Adults knew it was magic because they suddenly forgot all about their to-do lists and ditched their shoes and climbed in giggling just so they could lose themselves for a while in a story. The power of story. That is something I grew up with. My house was full of books. My parents read to me constantly as a child. And since my librarian mother's other degree was in ancient and medieval history, my bedtime stories were all about Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon rather than Cinderella, the wives of Henry VIII rather than the 3 Little Pigs. I was binging I, Claudius instead of the Disney Channel. Don't worry, I got sent out of the room for all the scenes that were, inappropriate, where there were massacres or incest. History fascinated me from a very early age, so that is where I gravitated as soon as I started to write stories of my own. The first story I ever wrote, I was 7 years old, and it was in pencil, covering the front and the back of an unlined sheet of typing paper, so you can imagine the lines wandering all over. And it was all about the assassination of King Edward II of England. I kid you not. I got that story out of my Kings and Queens of England paper doll book, and it had everything. It had regicide, adultery, a love triangle, power struggles resulting in, pools of blood on the floor, a bad queen. It was very Game of Thrones for a 7-year-old. And, honestly, it's probably fairly representative of what I would end up writing as an adult. My mother taught me how to type not long after that, which was a lot more fun in my history-centric household than it is in classrooms. Because instead of typing practice sentences like "the cat sat on the mat" or "the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog," my mom made up funny practice sentences for me from all walks of history for me to practice my typing on. So 2 that I remember are King Richard the Lionheart threw himself onto the sands of the holy shore and was promptly bitten by a jellyfish. And Napoleon's wife, Empress Josephine, stood peevishly in front of her wardrobe of 10,000 dresses and wondered which to wear. I learned a lot of interesting historical minutiae. I learned to type 80 words a minute by the time I was about 10. And that same year, I wrote my very first novel. Now, I really do want to be clear, that first novel was absolutely ghastly. It was 121 double-spaced typed pages of pure awful about a 10-year-old girl in medieval Ireland who was just like me, except that she had a horse, because, I wanted a horse. Of course I did. I was 10. And I don't remember too much more about this early piece of juvenilia, except for the fact that my version of Ireland had snakes in it, because I wasn't too into historical research when I was 10. And that, as bad as that book was, though, it kindled a fire in me. Because I was never not writing a book after that. I wrote 2 more by the time I was 13. My high school years were consumed by writing a massive fantasy historical trilogy based on the reign of Catherine the Great in Imperial Russia. Thousands of pages of long, which I finished at some point in my senior year. And I learned something along the way writing all those books. I learned that historical stories were where my heart lay. That was what I wanted to write. I learned a few basic things about how to craft a story, namely that it needs a beginning, a middle, and an end, and characters that change over the course of going from the beginning to the end. I learned that not all the heroines needed to be girls exactly my own age with a heavy dose of wish fulfillment for exactly what I wished was going on in my own life at the time. But it took me a little longer before I realized the theme of what I wanted to write. The common thread that would pull all my books together under a single umbrella. I went clear across the country to Boston University when I was 18, and since that was the summer that Gladiator had released in theaters, I ended up working on a novel of Imperial Rome. Now, for the next 6 years, I studied music. I was training to be an opera singer and following my professional musician father's heritage. But I was always in the background following my librarian mom's heritage as well, and I was writing books. Now, in retrospect, looking at my career plan of I'm going to be an opera singer, and if that doesn't work out, I'm going to be a novelist, I think I would look back at my teen self and say, have a plan C. I am very lucky that at least one of my plans worked out. Now, by the time I was out of graduate school and starting to go to opera auditions, I had at least 6 or 7 more novels under my belt, and I had started querying literary agents on the side as well. The way that worked was I would write a novel, I would look up all the agents in literary marketplace who were representing historical fiction, I would send them all personalized query letters, and then they would all say no. And then I would write another novel. I would query a new batch of agents. I would get another round of no's. I would write another novel and pretty much rinse and repeat. I had a lot of rejection letters, but eventually they began to get more encouraging, even when they said no. And a year or so after graduate school was done, I had a rejection that turned into an offer of representation. A literary agent refused the book that I was querying, but she liked my style enough and was encouraging enough that I was emboldened to ask if she would like to see something else of mine. She said yes, and I pulled that novel of Imperial Rome out from under my bed, the one that I had written some 8 years before as a freshman in my first year of college in a brand new city, far away from home. And that ended up being, 2 years later, my very first published novel, Empress of Rome. Now, it's been more than a decade since that first novel, and I have ended up covering a lot of eclectic ground. All of my books have been historical fiction, but at least outwardly, it has all been very different historical fiction. That first novel, it is about power struggles in the first century Roman Empire. It is all emperors and gladiators and Praetorian guards. It's marble and forums and colosseums. My most recent novel, The Diamond Eye, is set 2,000 years later than that, during World War II, and it is about the quiet library researcher who became the most effective female sniper in recorded history. Before she went on a goodwill tour to the United States. And that book is all about historians and soldiers and politicians. It's wartime trenches and sniper duels and glitzy Washington, D.C. parties. Now, how does a writer get from Imperial Rome to the World War II Eastern Front? Well, I will tell you. Because over the course of that 10 plus years, I finally figured out my theme. The thing all my books have in common, the thing that really fascinates me, the thing I want to write about above all. All my books, however different they may sound, have one common theme, and that theme is badass women of the past. Now, I often joke, and it honestly isn't even really a joke, that when I pick historical women to write about, I want to find ladies who are so cool, so courageous, so awe-inspiring, that you can imagine them, striding in slow motion in front of a wall of flame, like in a really cheesy action trailer, except that it actually doesn't seem cheesy. It just, gives a chill up your spine. And the thing I love is that you can find these women. They existed. They are in the pages of history. So let's talk about the extraordinary real-life ladies who inspired two of my most recent novels, The Alice Network and The Diamond Eye. One quick starting caveat, just to reassure you, this is a spoiler-free talk if you have not read either of those books. It will sound like I'm giving away whole swaths of plot, but I assure you I am not. I am just going to be talking about the fascinating stories behind the books and the real-life ladies who inspired me so much and will, I hope, inspire you. So let's start with the Alice Network. If I say the words female spies, that phrase probably conjures up images of slinky James Bond villainesses in silk dresses, purring double-edged one-liners through a haze of cigarette smoke, cuddling up to some hapless mark. The reality was rarely that glamorous, but the fact is that women have always been useful throughout history in espionage and the intelligence business. Mainly, that is because women could frequently go somewhere, eavesdrop somewhere, run messages, or pass information without being noticed, stopped, and suspected the way a man would be in the same place or time. A great many women during World War I were employed as spies, or as intelligence organizers, or as guides in aiding soldiers and prisoners to escape capture and make their way back to safe zones. The war's most successful spy network was known as the Alice Network, and it was run by a woman. Her name was Louise de Bettigny, and she was known as the Queen of Spies. So how does a spy mistress extraordinaire get her start? Well, Louise was born to an impoverished noble family in France, a tiny, vivacious blonde with lively intelligence, a quick wit, and a strong independent streak. She had an Oxford education, and she could speak English, German, and Italian fluently, as well as French. Like many impoverished gentlewomen from Jane Eyre on down, she supported herself as a governess, working for several noble European families. She was in France when the war broke out, and when she saw German forces invade and occupy her home city of Lille, she embarked on her first act of rebellion by creating a secret mail service. She collected hundreds of messages from friends and family who were desperate to communicate with their loved ones in unoccupied France. She transcribed those messages on a petticoat with lemon juice. The letters become visible when the petticoat is ironed. It's like an early form of invisible ink. And she departed for the unoccupied zone via a stop through England. It was in England that a sharp-eyed captain in British intelligence met Louise, was very impressed with her cunning, her courage, and her language skills, and recruited her as a spy. Now, it's important to note that when Louise got started, the intelligence business didn't have the reputation of glamour and courage that it acquired later. Ian Fleming and the Bond franchise did a lot to redeem the espionage business in the eyes of the world. It made it more glamorous, more exciting, and certainly more acceptable to the public. In 1914, however, spying was regarded as a necessary but dirty business. Spies were not figures of glamour. They were sneaks who opened other people's mail and stood around listening to gentlemen's conversations through doors. And if it was a dirty job for a man, it was a doubly dirty job for a woman. Good old double standards, alive and well. Now, none of this appears to have bothered Louise de Bettigny, or in fact, any of the women I researched who became spies. I suspect female practicality had a hand there. There are some ladies who are just not designed by nature to roll bandages, and they would have known that spying was one of the very few ways they could actively join the fight to serve their country in war. With Germans occupying your hometown, making daily life miserable, when you could walk down a street and see German street signs renamed over their native language signs, and see your clocks all reset to German time. Well, there are many women who are burning to join the fight in any way that they could. Louise joined British intelligence in late 1914 or early 1915, age about 35. She was trained in spy skills such as ciphers, invisible inks, map reading, and message smuggling, and she returned to France under the codename Alice Dubois. Now, when we think of occupied France, we tend to think of World War II and the Nazis, but the World War I occupation was really every bit as wretched. German soldiers were billeted in French households. German requisition parties could walk into your home at any time to confiscate everything from the food in your icebox to your curtain rods. Identity checks and roll calls and forced labor were levied on civilians, and even the slightest show of disrespect to German rule could result in prison time. And execution was threatened for anyone who aided Germany's enemies. Lille probably suffered the worst of it of any city in occupied France, and that became Louise's base as she set up her network of agents, a web soon known as the Alice Network after her codename. Louise eventually managed more than 80 sources, but she had special allies. Her chief lieutenant within the network was another woman, a young Red Cross nurse named Leoni Van Hoot, who had already helped her brother escape from occupied France to the Netherlands, and then did the 65-mile trek 4 more times, helping other stranded servicemen. She became Louise's right-hand woman and closest friend. With her help, Louise recruited many more. There was nothing those two could not do once they were teamed up. Some of the people recruited had necessary skills in photography or forgery. Some were workers in cafes or railway stations or restaurants, places where crucial information could be gleaned. There's one fabulous story that did not make it into the Alice Network. I could not figure out where to shoehorn it in, where there was a mother whose window overlooked a train station. Now, the Germans being a little touchy about French people who seemed too interested in German troop movements, she used to sit by her window knitting. Because, of course, a woman who's knitting cannot possibly be up to no good, right? Any knitters in the crowd? Yes, I'm definitely feeling it. While she was knitting, she would be tapping signals with her heels on the floor. This works better with a hard floor. To her children in the room below. While they appeared to be doing their homework, they were actually jotting down the codes that she was communicating, and all of this happened under the nose of the German railway marshal, who they had been forced to billet in their house. Collected information was left at drop points, where it would be summarized by Louise into a single letter, coded, copied into tiny letters onto little rice paper slips, and smuggled out of occupied France. Now, that was the dangerous part, because Germans had forbidden paper with printing or handwriting to cross borders, and they posted frequent checkpoints to spot suspicious activity. Louise was one of the very best at bluffing her way through checkpoints. She passed across borders with coded messages rolled up inside shoe heels or inside umbrella staffs, wrapped around hairpins or the inner band of a ring. She knew exactly how to play the guards, whether by acting the witless female, chattering gossip, far too dumb to possibly be up to anything suspicious, or by taking so long to fumble with an armload of packages that the guards got fed up, mumbled something about women and their shopping, and waved her on through. She once said, "With any paper one sticks under their nose and plenty of self-possession, one can get through." But the risks of being involved in espionage were very high. Spies did not count as prisoners of war. They could be tried and shot by firing squad, whether male or female. More lenient punishment might be a life sentence of hard labor in a German prison. That was about the best you could hope for. There was always the chance that German justice could be rougher and more immediate. A bullet in the head right there in the street. No trial. But that didn't faze Louise or her agents, who were hugely successful at their job. The information the Alice Network passed on to the British was efficiently gathered, cleanly transcribed, and swiftly communicated to her superiors, who gushed over her like teenage girls at a One Direction concert. They called Louise, a regular Joan of Arc, really high-class agent. At several points, her intelligence might have turned the entire course of the war. In the summer of 1915, for example, she got news of an impending visit by the Kaiser to the German front. She passed the date and time of his arriving train, which very narrowly escaped being bombed by British planes. It could have been a very different war and a very different world history if they had succeeded. Now, I focused on Louise when talking about the World War I women spies, but she was hardly the only woman to face incredible danger while serving in that way. Red Cross nurse Edith Cavell secretly housed wounded English and French soldiers in her clinic before they could be smuggled to safety. Martha Knockert was awarded the Iron Cross by the Germans for her dedication in nursing wounded German soldiers, who never dreamed that she was gathering and passing information all along to the British. Young Belgian Gabrielle Petit, she led downed pilots from behind enemy lines to safety, although she was just a teenager. These are just a few of the real-life women who rose up to spy on the invaders. Louise's network was eventually brought down by its own success. The Alice Network's outstanding work drew a little too much attention to itself. The Germans could hardly fail to notice that there was an entire section of occupied territory that seemed literally cursed and unable to maintain artillery positions or secure locations for any sustained length of time. Security doubled down, and after 9 months of dazzling success, luck ran out for the Queen of Spies. First Leoni and then Louise de Bettigny were arrested in the fall of 1915. They were tried together and sentenced to life sentences in Siegburg prison. Louise wrote to a friend, "I accept my sentence with courage. During my operation, I envisioned death calmly and without fear. Today, I add a feeling of joy and pride because I refused to denounce anyone. And I hope those I saved through my silence will be grateful and thank me by keeping me in their prayers. I declare that I prefer the rigors of my sentence to the dishonor of exonerating myself by denouncing those who did their duty to their country." She was held for 5 months before her trial and never gave up a single name. In fall of 1918, the women of Siegburg prison were released. That is something I would have loved to have seen. Women with prison haircuts laughing and weeping for joy, flooding for the trains that would take them home, knowing that they had been captured, but knowing that they had beaten the Germans in the long run, and that their own efforts in espionage and resistance work had had a part to play. Was Louise de Bettigny among those survivors? You will have to read the book to find out. Now that we've talked about the ladies of the Alice Network, let's go in a different direction. Women who work in espionage most certainly put their lives on the line, but their work is clandestine and largely behind the scenes. What about wartime women in the starkest danger of all? Women fighting on the front lines. Yes, they existed, even in World War II, when we tend to imagine most ladies conducted their fight well away from the battlefields. Not so. Before I dive into the incredible woman badass whose very real life inspired The Diamond Eye, my most recent book, let me ask you all a question. Who here has seen the movie Encanto? Maybe 100 times or so, if you've got kids or grandkids. I thought so. Don't worry, you can put your hand down. I'm not going to call on anyone. Now, the song We Don't Talk About Bruno is very catchy, but it was actually another song that caught me much harder, and that is the song Surface Pressure. As a woman sings in the movie about the incredible pressure of trying to be strong for her family, trying to bear up under a seemingly impossible weight of expectations and life burdens. There is not a woman I talked to, myself included, who did not take that song like a dagger in the heart. To be human is to be subjected at some point during our lives to pressure that will threaten to crush us. And women are especially prone to feel crushed under the weight of supporting family, children, work, societal expectations, a burden so heavy even Superwoman would stagger. Add to that the pressure if you happen to be the only woman in a profession dominated by men. The spies of the Alice Network at least worked among lots of other women, but women in the army during World War II were rare gems. The Diamond Eye is about a real-life superwoman, and it is also about pressure. It tells the story of a fascinating real-life woman from the Kyiv region, a single mother, a graduate student, a library researcher, whose life was upended when Hitler invaded her homeland and who ended up becoming the most effective female sniper of all time. Racking up a tally of 309 enemy invaders on the battlefield, she was sent to the United States on a goodwill tour in 1942, becoming America's sweetheart and close friends with none other than Eleanor Roosevelt. Her story is real. Her name is Lyudmila Pavlichenko, nicknamed Lady Death, which is just the scariest, coolest thing ever, right? Hearing a nickname like that, you might be surprised, and I certainly was when I began my research, to find just how human, how relatable, how warm Mila Pavlichenko really was. This was not some real-life Black Widow from a Marvel movie, raised from childhood to be a killer. This is a very ordinary girl, a tomboy who loved books and sports alike, a teen mother subjected to the incredible pressure of remaking her life when she had a brand new baby and a lousy ex who walked out on both of them within weeks. She stepped up to the challenge, just like the quietly heroic supermoms we see all over the place. Yet another single woman juggling a job, a child, and night school, all at the same time, somehow making it all work. And like other young Soviets, she would have also had to make time for party meeting lectures on such riveting subjects as, young communists today, where I imagine her in the back, sitting in the back, quietly catching up on her sleep. When it came to hobbies, Mila knew how to shoot. She was the daughter of a soldier. She went to the range sometimes with work friends for fun. She decided to take an advanced course in marksmanship at some point, but she never planned to use those skills on a human target to take a human life. Her aim was to finish grad school, become a historian, and make a better home for herself and her son. That's all she wanted. She was a library researcher working on her dissertation at the Odessa Public Library when Hitler invaded Russia and Ukraine, and everything changed. Now, there is something of an elephant in the room here, I am aware, talking about Russia and Ukraine. Believe me, the fact that I published this book and the war basically happened immediately, that I did not anticipate that. The fact is that this novel is set during a time in history when Ukraine was, quite unhappily, part of the Soviet Union. It can make us uncomfortable to contemplate a time when Russia was our ally. Yet at this point they were. They were not necessarily the most trusted ally, but they were an ally, and they were a critical one. Without Soviet forces soaking up so much of Hitler's manpower and supplies in the East, the Allied fight in the West might very well have been lost. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had a Russian father who worked for the state and believed in the system. Her writings make it clear that she considered herself both Russian and Soviet, yet she was born in Ukraine. She loved her homeland, and all of her fighting was done on Ukrainian soil in defense of Ukrainian civilians. Her motivation to fight was all about survival, not politics. Hitler had invaded her homeland with overwhelming force, and his armies regarded Ukrainians and Russians as racial undesirables fit only for extermination. For Mila Pavlichenko, who was in Odessa enjoying a day at the beach with friends when she heard Germany invaded, it was simple. If ordinary civilians like her did not resist, then her homeland would be churned under Hitler's war machine, and her son would grow up in the Hitler Youth, learning how to sig heil. For Mila, enlisting in the Red Army was not just the least bad of all possible options, it was the only option. Today, she would have answered Zelensky's call, and she would be on the front lines in Kyiv pushing back the Russian invaders. In 1941, the invaders were German. Her answer was the same: fight. So she enlisted in the Red Army, which was 95% male and 5% female. And the library researcher and single mom took on yet another burden, another job, another responsibility. She became a soldier, which is just proof, if any of us needed it, that you do not ever underestimate librarians. Now, I am no apologist for the Soviet Union, but the USSR was the only allied nation to officially employ women in combat in World War II. English women, French women, American women, they served on the home front or in support roles, as we've already learned, but if they had any kind of active fight, it was in a clandestine role, like espionage or partisan fighting or maybe code breaking. Only Soviet women were actually handed rifles or bombers or tanks and allowed to fight in the Army and the Air Force, which is not to say they had an easy time of it. When Mila Pavlichenko went to enlist in a dress and sandals the day after war was declared, the recruiter first tried to push her into being a nurse, then laughed her out of his office. Nevertheless, she persisted, and she soon found herself on the front lines at the siege of Odessa. And as soon as she had a rifle in her hands, she began racking up a tally and became a sniper. Now, Hollywood has colored our view of sharpshooters. At worst, we think of them as militarized serial killers. At best, they are the odd man out on the squad of regular guys, the one described as having ice water in his veins. Anyone else remember the scripture-quoting sniper from Saving Private Ryan by Spielberg? But Mila's writings make it clear. She did not celebrate her kills, and she disliked the fame that began to attach itself to her name. She saw herself simply as a defender, a stressed-out woman with a difficult job to do, and she put her head down and she did it, working under a very grim reality. All snipers like Mila knew that they would not be taken captive if they were captured by Nazis. They would be immediately shot. Yes, it's against the rules, but everybody knew it happened. So what does it take to succeed as a sniper? Well, for one thing, it takes a surprising amount of science. Making very precise shots is not just about pulling a trigger. And the memoir Mila Pavlichenko wrote in later life made that clear. Snipers have to understand wind speed and lateral drift, how to calculate distance and angle like a mathematician. Even so, being successful as a sniper really wasn't about making impossible long-distance shots. It was much more mental and emotional. You had to have the internal toughness to be able to lie still for hours without moving. Wait in shadows for the perfect opportunity, all for the chance to take one shot at someone whose face you could probably see in your crosshairs. Ordinary soldiers often fire blind at the enemy, and they use adrenaline to carry themselves through battles, and they fight in a unit with their fellow soldiers around them for support. A sniper has to suppress adrenaline, has to work mostly alone, and focus intently on who they're going to kill, and has to keep doing that day after day, week after week, month after month. There is a deep level of intimacy there that ordinary soldiers do not have to deal with. Thus, there are a great many shooters who might be able to sink 10 shots into a target the size of a dime half a mile away, but who do not have the kind of emotional strength and control necessary to be a sniper. Mila Pavlichenko had it, and despite the fact that women are supposed to be the emotional ones, she was one of about 2,000 female snipers to fight against Hitler. And their fight was not only against the Third Reich. Even as Mila passed 100, 200, 300 on her tally, she was also fighting her own side. Soviet women pilots at least tended to be grouped in all-female regiments or lumped with their sister pilots if they served in mixed regiments. But women soldiers in the Red Army were surrounded and outnumbered by men at all times, and they tended to be regarded as sexual perks for the officers. If they turned down advances from their superiors, they faced everything from assault to being passed over for promotions and decorations. Mila Pavlichenko trained and led an all-male sniper platoon and had to argue with her own recruits about whether or not she was really in charge and entitled to give them orders. The Red Army did not even supply its female members with enough cloth to deal with their periods or boots that fit their feet. So you can add all kinds of ordinary, ugly sexism to the list of burdens that this woman and her sister soldiers carried. The Eastern Front was already a horror show. Mila called it her baptism of fire. The weather was brutal, the casualty rates were appalling, the soldiers were ill-trained, under-equipped, and almost as likely to be shot by their own officers if they showed a single sign of faltering as by the enemies on the other side of the battle line. Mila ended up fighting in 2 desperate sieges, Odessa and Sevastopol. And in less than 18 months of fighting, she was wounded at least 4 times, racked up an official tally of 309, and earned that nickname Lady Death. Famous by then, she was pulled off of frontline service and sent to Washington, D.C. on a goodwill tour. She was one of the first Soviet guests to be hosted overnight at the White House. And even then, struggling by now under the burdens of still healing physical wounds and PTSD, she had to fight the good fight against American reporters who wanted to know about her makeup routine and the length of her skirt, and openly doubted whether she was a propaganda fake, because, surely no woman could actually be a sniper. But she kept going, even when questions like, what kind of underwear do you prefer? And can you wear lipstick at the front? Probably felt like the last damn straw. She won the U.S. public over. She asked for American aid to be sent to her friends still fighting at home. And all of this while she had been separated from her young son for more than a year. Now, it might sound like I've given away her whole story, but I have not, I promise. I haven't touched on the incredible partnership she forged with her platoon, the swooningly romantic real-life story of the fellow soldier who won her heart on the front lines, and the incredible, unlikely friendship and partnership she forged with none other than First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. You do have to read The Diamond Eye to find all of that. What I would like to focus on here, just like in that Encanto song, is pressure. Ultimately, none of us know what we are capable of until we are tested. Mila Pavlichenko did not want to be a sniper. She was a history geek who wanted to be a historian, spend her life among books, and build a better life for her son. But her country was invaded, and so she decided to fight, and the quiet library researcher discovered that she had a warrior inside. In an ideal world, there would be no baptisms of fire. Mothers would raise their children in peace, and aspiring historians would finish their degrees without ever having to pick up a gun. But when the pressure's on, when danger raises the stakes, when war looms, everyone finds out what they are made of. That is what Mila's extraordinary life showed me, and that's what I wanted to make The Diamond Eye about. An ordinary woman turned by pressure into a diamond. Pressure and potential. You've heard me talk about 2 very different books today, and the historic women who inspired them. For the most part, they began as ordinary women, women like us, teachers and students, secretaries and nurses, mothers and daughters. But they were called from their ordinary lives. They answered that call. They pushed themselves to the limit and beyond, whether their fight involved smuggling information or pulling a trigger. And they proved themselves, these ordinary women, as utterly extraordinary. reminding us that we all, within our everyday humdrum lives, carry the same possibility inside. I love looking for these courageous ladies of history, whether it's history hundreds or thousands of years in the past, or whether it's as recent as the 20th century, because these women existed. Restoring them to the public eye is a very real tribute to them, and a reminder that there are scores of other historically significant women out there, waiting to be rediscovered and resurrected, waiting to be honored, waiting for their deeds to inspire the women of the future who stand on their shoulders. Remembering these ladies, whose contributions so often went unrecognized and untold during their lifetimes, makes it so that their legacies become ours. And that is the story I want to tell with every book that I write. Thank you.
We're gonna take some questions.
All right, we do have plenty of time for Q&A, so I know there are going to be hands and people with mics going up and down. What am I working on now? I actually have 2 books that I'm working on now. My next novel, which I am, God help me, in edits for right now, and I have to hand in about 3 weeks, is a co-authored novel with my friend, the Canadian historical fiction author Janie Chang, and it is titled The Phoenix Crown, and it is about what happens when a New York opera singer and a Chinatown seamstress are thrown together during the chaos of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So that is the next one that will be out fall of next year. After that, my next solo novel is titled right now The Briar Club, and that is about an all-female boarding house in the early 1950s in Washington, D.C. And so we're talking the Cold War, McCarthyism, the Red Scare, Lavender Scare, the Korean War, the shutting down of the women's World War II baseball leagues. All of that is going in it. So that should be out spring 2024.
Who kept score of her kills? How was that done?
Who kept score of her kills? Yeah, actually, that's quite a scientific thing that was done, which is that kills have to be confirmed for a sniper to be able to count them. And generally that means either they need to have a witness to the shot, which has to be an officer who can verify that, or they need to be able to collect some kind of proof, either dog tags or papers from the bodies. She actually talks in her memoir about how she disliked having to, search bodies afterward. It was distasteful to her, but she knew intelligence could use whatever paperwork that they found. And that was the kind of thing, if you could bring back proof, that would also be added to your tally. But it brings up the question of, was her real tally 309? Probably not. It could have been less. It very also easily could have been much more, because she also just simply fought as a soldier side by side with her battalion plenty of times, and nobody is counting shots then in the middle of a battle. So did she probably have more than was on her tally? I'd say yes. But at some point, especially if you're being sent on a goodwill tour, everybody wants a nice round number. So it's, even I have it, at least in my version of the book, that she probably isn't sure how many there are, because there's no way in the fog of war to be absolutely sure. But we do have the number of 309. That's what there is for official records. Over here.
Thank you. No, just talk. In the Alice Network, when Louise sent that information about the impending attack on Verdun, British intelligence didn't believe it. Why would they have not believed a woman that was this efficient in information?
The question is there's a certain bit in the Alice Network, which actually does come from life, is that one of the last reports Louise de Bettigny passed on was the knowledge that there was going to be a big push at Verdun. and they knew this. This was, sometime in advance. British intelligence actually did believe it. They were willing to believe anything that she told them at that point. She had a good record. The French generals in the field decided not to act on it. And that's one of the things about the intelligence service, is that in the end, you can pass information, but it also has to be acted on correctly. And that's the part where the people who did the spying, they have no control over that. All they can do is pass it on and pray.
Explain more clearly why you named the book The Diamond Eye.
Yes, I named it The Diamond Eye because a number of reasons. One being is when you're writing a women's fiction novel, you want to have a title that is going to indicate, for your audience, yes, this is a women's fiction novel for the, because you want people to have a sense of what they're going to get. And I liked diamond because it is associated with, women, but on the other hand, it isn't soft. It doesn't make it sound like a soft story. And also there's the association with it of sharpness, clarity, things that go with, a sniper's vision. I liked eye just because, that's, again, the thing that you can associate with the sniper. And then it also really came from the fact there was this very bizarre episode, and promise this is not a spoiler, which really came from Mila's Goodwill tour in America, where she was going around doing these tours of various cities, and one of her doing speeches, to raise money and ask for aid for the Eastern Front. And at one of the cities she spoke at, an American millionaire heard her speak and fell madly in love with her and started following her around from city to city, like trying to get to know her better. And, really, it's one of those things where I imagine her thinking, it's like, what exactly about me and my 309 tally made you think great wife material? Perfect. But he proposed marriage. And her entire reaction was pretty much, who are you? No. So, but he took his refusal gracefully, but he gave her a farewell gift before she left, which was a set of diamond jewelry. Necklace, earrings, bracelet, brooch, ring, like a whole set. And I did the conversion rate because we have a receipt for it. That was like a 6-figure set of jewelry. So some really serious gems here. And with a note that said, "We will meet again." Now, according to her, they never did, because she's like, when are we going to meet again? I'm leaving, and I'm probably not coming back. And she didn't. So according to the memoir, she never did see this guy again, although she had this diamond jewelry for the rest of her life. And I thought immediately, of course, what if they did meet again? Because I'm the novelist. What if is what I have to ask. So I created a slightly different outcome for who this man was. And did they actually meet again? And, if you think about it, "we will meet again" can be romantic, or can't it also be a little threatening? So you'll have to see what I did with it in the book. But the fact is that her memoir and her life really did give me this thing where there were diamonds, already in the plot, as it were. And it's kind of like Tolstoy's smoking gun, the gun on the mantelpiece. If you have diamonds in a plot, you got to use them. So they get used, and I kind of thought, too, it's like with that mixed together with everything else very nicely. And so I ended up thinking of diamonds as being a nice theme throughout, because also, as I talked about today, it was about pressure. The whole idea of a diamond is that it is a lump, coal that is subjected to tremendous pressure and becomes something beautiful. And that is also what happens with her. She's an ordinary person who is subjected to tremendous pressure and turns into something dazzling. So all of that came together, and I came up with The Diamond Eye, and my publisher fortunately liked it.
Hello. Hi. I have 2 questions. One, what is her distinction between Russian and Ukrainian? Is she one or the other? Is she Ukrainian or is she Russian? And the second question is, why did they take her off the battlefield in 42 and send her to Washington? That seemed kind of odd to me.
The question is, first of all, difference between her being Ukrainian or Russian. She was Ukrainian-born. She was born in the Kyiv region, so she was definitely Ukrainian-born. That's where her family lived. However, her father was Russian. Pavlichenko, which is her married name, that is a Ukrainian name, and her husband was Ukrainian. But her maiden name was Belov, or Belova for her, which was a Russian name. And so she considered herself Russian, and she sort of considered them all, we're all under the Soviet umbrella. What kind of difference does it make? Because she was, her father was a believer in the system. It appears she was as well. If she had her doubts or discontents, she did not voice those in her memoir, but she would not have done because the Soviet propaganda office would see what she was writing. So we don't know how patriotic she was as far as, did she have thoughts about Ukrainian independence? I don't know. We will not know that from her documents because those would have been censored or, just never written down. The thing I have been very encouraged by, though, is that even though she did fight for the Red Army, and all her fighting was done on Ukrainian soil, Ukrainian civilians she was defending, Ukraine in the modern day has very much embraced her as their national heroine, not as a Russian national heroine. And if you don't believe me, look up any article about her online, which will always have some title like famous World War II Russian sniper. And one of the first comments you will see in any comments section is, she was not Russian, she was Ukrainian. And I have to say, I've certainly thought about that with the way Ukrainian women have been tearing it up on the modern day battlefield and front line, and even the civilians as well. There actually was a sort of a hark back to Lyudmila Pavlichenko with a modern day female Ukrainian sniper who was not named for the press, for the article I read about her. She was not named and her face was not shown, only her eyes and this very bundled up rifle she carried. But her the sign, the name she went under was Charcoal. So that was that. And the second half of the question was, why was she pulled off the battlefield and sent on this Goodwill tour? Well, the Goodwill tour, first of all, she was recovering from wounds, and she was between postings. And so they probably thought, well, she can recover and she can be a propaganda girl at the same time. And literally she heard them talk about, she knows that in part she was sent because she used to be a student. It was supposed to be originally like a student conference. So she had a good war record and she was a student. And they also thought, and she heard them say this, well, women, I'm not sure about sending women on overseas, and they're a little harder to control, aren't they? They're emotional. And then, the answer to that was, yeah, but if they're pretty, they'll reflect well on us. So, she's pretty enough. Let's send her. So really it was that. And then she and they were such a success in this brief conference that what was supposed to be a relatively short trip turned into a months-long Goodwill tour, which was not part of the original plan. But Eleanor Roosevelt really believed in what they were trying to do, which was, it's very easy for us to think that, once Pearl Harbor was bombed, America was all into the war, all in, and we weren't necessarily. There was the war in the Pacific for sure, but there were still factions that wanted Roosevelt to keep out of the war in Europe, and there was, this was when the Soviets were taking very, very heavy losses. We're talking millions dead, and they needed aid desperately. So they were desperate to get aid from the U.S. Roosevelt, and by extension, Eleanor, wanted to also, encourage Americans to get behind the idea of sending aid to Europe. And so they really embraced Lyudmila and the rest as, yes, let's go, let's get you on the road, let's have you talking to people, let's make you human to an American audience, and let's have you talk about how badly you need this. And so what was supposed to be a very quick trip while she recovered, was in between posts, really became this very long thing, and by the time she came back, she was famous. Because they not only went to the US, they went to Canada, then they went to the UK. She met Churchill. She met Clementine Churchill. She met everybody in Canada as well. It's like she was famous by then, and at that point they decided to pull her off the front lines, although she very much wanted to go back and continue fighting in Stalingrad. But they decided to put her on instructor duty instead and let her spend the rest of the war teaching sniping skills to new recruits. And partly that was because they thought her skills would be better used in being able to instruct as many as possible to be effective. But also it was because they thought at that point she was too valuable to send back to the front lines, because the risks of a sniper's job being what they were, she would probably get killed. And that would be a big propaganda coup for the German side. So they decided she was too valuable to send back to the battlefield with the fame she had accrued, and they put her on instructor duty instead. And she spent the rest of the year instructing other recruits in how to be snipers, and she trained probably thousands.
We don't have time for more questions, but Kate has
sorry.
graciously said she'll stick around and sign books. So if you'd like her book signed, please line up against this wall and please join me. There are also other titles of Kate's for sale in the back of the room, but please join me again in thanking Kate Quinn.